Well, President Donald Trump has renewed his threat to cut ties with China a day after his top diplomats held talks with Beijing. It comes as his trade representative said he did not consider decoupling the US and Chinese economies as a viable option. Joining me now live is Professor Joe Siracusa from RMIT. Professor, good afternoon. Good to see you. Thank you for joining me.
Well, good afternoon. My pleasure.
Is this a surprise, do you think, though, considering we've had the pandemic, there's been tensions between the two countries over that, China's move, of course, to impose security legislation on Hong Kong? How serious is Donald Trump's threat now?
Oh, he's very serious. Look, I've said on your shows for the last couple of years that this tariff war percolates everything. It poisons the relationship, social, economic, political, diplomatic. And so now we're coming to that point where Donald Trump is threatening not cutting off China diplomatically, but to cut off China economically. And that's like saying you're going to cut off your right arm because China and the United States are symbiotic trading partners. They actually live off each other with supply chains and all the rest of it. So what Trump is saying is that he's done talking to China. And by the way, President Xi, by not contradicting president, is saying that he's done with Donald Trump. So Chinese are waiting for the next election to see if they can deal with Joe Biden or somebody else. But look, this is very serious. So the stock market has not responded in a dreadful way because capitalism will always find a way. But this is that downhill spiral, and the Chinese are now sending important signals. You know, they got a new cutting edge here. They don't have to deal with the United States. That is, they don't have to placate Donald Trump in other areas, such as helping them with North Korea. They can do what they want in the South China Sea. They can do what they want in the Taiwan Strait. They can do what they want in Hong Kong. They can do what they want in the Himalayas with an American ally. I mean, America is allied for all intents and purposes with India. And so the Chinese are adding some muscle, and there's some violence going on, and they don't care how it ends, and they don't care what the Americans say. And that's the absence of American leadership. American leadership means that you don't mess around with Washington. Well, they are messing around with Washington. We've now entered an era of great power competition. We no longer have that restraint that Moscow and Washington had. And so we're beginning to get a free-for-all. And I'll tell you what, Australia is looking at this very carefully, too, because every time the defense minister or the foreign minister here says that China is interfering with coronavirus data or with Australian hacking, it's all because Australia is seen as an ally of the United States. So I think when Australia takes a hit, what the Chinese are doing all the time is probing. They want to know what Australia is going to do when and if China comes down hard in Hong Kong, and they will. They want to know what Australia is going to do when and if the United States does nothing about the Taiwan Strait. I mean, the Chinese mainland can be there in 24 hours. We're going to do anything about it. And so Australia should be on guard now because the Chinese might want to probe America by knocking Australia around. For example, shooting at a battle or at a cruiser or something in the China Sea. I mean, I don't put it past Chinese to think things. Now, look, these comments are not anti-Chinese; they're just anti-Chinese behavior.
Well,
Chinese act like gangsters.
Yes.
They can expect this kind of thing. This is gangster diplomacy is on the rise.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, what could potentially be Australia's role in this? You mentioned hacking. We know that yesterday Scott Morrison issued a warning that organisations were being targeted by a sophisticated state-based hacker. Now, a number of security experts have come out saying that China could be to blame. We don't know this, but, you know, given our alliance with the US, what could be Australia's role moving forward?
Well, look, we increasingly know that the Chinese or someone close to the Chinese are behind these kinds of things. We have the Chinese ambassador threatening Australia with tourism and students and all the rest of it. I mean, these are all of one cloth. You know, they're talking like this all the time. And so Australia will probably increase its ties with the United States. It will increase its ties with India and Japan. Australia is seen as one of those places where America can disperse its strategic assets. And Australia sees the United States as a defense against Chinese incursions in the area. I mean, the Chinese are not going to invade Australia, but of course they will turn Australia's region into a Chinese lake in terms of the initiative that's going on in terms of economics and buying the small nations and the islands around it. And so Australia will will take a lot of heat here. And if China wants to send a message to the United States, one of the best ways to do it is to sink an Australian ship in freedom of navigation drills to see if the United States, or not even sink it, just damage it or ram it, better yet, to see if the United States will do anything for Australia, because Australia on its own can't do much about this. Australia counts on its great and powerful friends, and it has since 1945 when it transferred relations emphasis from Britain to the United States. So, yeah, they could probe the United States relationship by pushing Australia around, and Australia is going to have to come up firm on this. Otherwise, the Chinese will get the wrong message. I mean, I see this violence everywhere, and so I expect something else. But the cybersecurity is important, because even if you don't want to knock an Australian ship out of the water, you can stop the toilets from working electronically. You can do all kinds of things electronically. And look, interfering in people's and nations interfering in each other's lives, that's as old as the Bible, for goodness sakes. I mean, people always do that.
Yeah,
they
absolutely.
did that with spies and espionage. Now they're doing it with cybersecurity and emerging technologies.
Yeah.
This is all part of the game. Is Australia ready for this test of wills coming up? I don't think so, because, there isn't sort of a unanimity in this country about what's coming down the road. And so Australia is going to have to recalibrate its national interests. And who knows, the day may come when Australia really will have to choose between Beijing and Washington. But up to now, Australia and everyone else has to deal with the rising violence of Chinese diplomacy.
Absolutely, and it's an interesting world that we are living in. Professor, I just want to talk about the tensions now between China and India. This week, Narendra Modi came out saying that he will defend the country's border in that disputed Himalayan region, as you just mentioned before. In terms of the border dispute with China, could this potentially push India closer to some of Beijing's rivals?
Oh, absolutely. Look, this clash is in the exact place where China and India fought a war in 1962. They lost several hundred men on both sides. And it's about a long border. It's a dispute in a small area, but they have a border of 2,100 miles, which is a very large border. So there's always, and it's undefined. It's up in the hills and all the rest of it. Yes, and I think because of the pressure that China is putting on India, and keep in mind here, the Indians can give the Chinese a lesson here. In the Himalayas, the Indians have the advantage in terms of manpower, expertise, aircraft, tanks, and all the rest of it. Chinese are worried about other things in other parts of the world. So, but the Indians can do pretty well, and I think India will be forced more and more to turn to its friends. Its major friend now, they've made a major pivot to the United States. They're getting closer to Japan. The Japanese, I think, Prime Minister was recently there. And as part of this quad business, the quadrilateral thing, Australia is part of the four deals. So I think India will increasingly turn to Japan, the United States, and even to Australia, as they have these drills from year to year, that they have an arrangement. And I think in the meantime, I think the Chinese will put a lot of pressure on Pakistan, to put a lot of pressure on India. So the Chinese-Pakistani thing will mature a little bit. Now, what we're looking at is in 1962, all these people were going at each other, but they didn't have nuclear weapons. Today, all the players in South Asia have nuclear weapons. And an exchange of 10 or 15 missiles there, warheads, would induce the nuclear winter that Carl Sagan predicted in the 1980s, which would end agriculture in most of the world. So there'd be all kinds of hell to pay for that. That's why it's important, because they all have nuclear weapons. Will they use nuclear weapons for a border dispute? Not because they want to, but because it might escalate or accidentally move into that area. And the only reason that Modi says he's going to do something about this, because the opposition Congress party is all over his back to do something about this. I mean, those 20 men who were killed, they were killed with iron rods, for God's sakes. I mean, they were brutally, it was barbarism.
Yes.
And so the Indians can't handle that.
No.
And so they're going to have to respond. So Modi's going to have to do something. He doesn't want to go to war with China, but I'll tell you what, Modi is not afraid of war with China, and I think the Chinese would get a bloody nose on this, the way they did when they went to war with Vietnam after the Vietnam War, and the Vietnamese gave them a little lesson in military. So the Chinese military, they spend a lot of money on arms and all that kind of thing. But, at the end of the day, it's all about people on the ground and how they fight. And the Indians are very good fighters, and they had a lot of experience in the past. And they're bunkered down in that part of the world in the Himalayas, and I think they're prepared to fight.
Yep.
And so the Chinese are going to have to be very careful about what happens next. We don't have to worry about the Chinese. Chinese shouldn't be worried about us.
Yeah, well, look, it's certainly one to watch, an interesting territory between the two. Professor Joe Siracusa, I appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.